This is the beginning of a series on Apollo and his relationship to St. Paul. I'd like to begin with the Apollia from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. The Apollia were the offerings made at the initiation of a young man, Kouros, at a meeting of a family group, Fratria, of the Northwest Greeks. Apollaios is the month of these rites and offerings, and Apollon, the Doric form of Apollo, is the Megistos Kouros, the great Kouros. The brotherhood, the Fratri, controlled the access to civic rites. There was a 3-day family festival with initiation ceremonies not concerning the state. The father introduced his young child, then again as a child, Ephebos, who would become a grown-up, Kouros, and the husband his wife after the marriage. The 3-day festival of the Northwest Greeks was called Apolli and was similar with the Ionic Apaturia. The 3 relative offerings of Apolli, at least in Delphi, were Paidia, for child, Apollia, youth, and Gamella, marriage, gamos in Greek. I'd like to make a comment about that. Go ahead and match Peter up with the Paidia for child. Go ahead and match Paul up with Apollia, the youth. And match John the Baptist with his camel hair shirt to Gamella, marriage, gamos in Greek. According to Plutarch, it was a custom for those who from children were initiated to grown-up Korai to go to Delphi and offer there the hair of their head to the god Apollo. Theseus went there, and he only shaved the forepart of his head. Apollo is the unshorn Phoebos. A similar offering was made in the Apaturia, which was called Koreion, for kero, to cut or especially hair, and corresponds to Apollyon. Now I would like to read from the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. Apollo is a Greek god whose name occurs as a theophoric element in numerous Greek names, of which Apollos is a diminutive. For instance, Apollonius, and you have numerous other names that would derive from Apollo one way or the other, Paulus, and such. Apollo is the most typical divine representative of classical Greek culture, the Greek god par excellence, though there is no doubt that he was of non-Greek origin. The 2 cult centers of Apollo, Delos and Delphi, date from the 8th century BCE. The Delos sanctuary was primarily devoted to Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, according to the myth. At Delphi, Apollo was considered an intruder by the Greeks themselves. It was there that he killed the snake Python, the son of Earth, and the lord of that place. He had to leave Delphi again in search of purification. The attempts to locate his origin in a specific region, especially the northeast of Europe or Asia Minor, proved unsuccessful because of the lack of conclusive evidence. The once promising alleged Hittite god Apollonius disappeared thanks to a better decipherment of the Hittite hieroglyphs. These are old sources, so that actually may have been overturned and they may have found Apollonius again. Okay, so of the many etymological explanations which have been proposed for the name Apollo, none has found general acceptance. However, following a suggestion by Harrison, Burkert has again pointed out that there is a close connection with the name of the month Apollaios and the institution of the Apelli. In epic literature, and at Delos and Delphi, the god's name is always spelled Apollon. In the Doric dialect, we find Apollon, and on Cyprus, Apollon. In Thessaly, Aplun. At the beginning of the present era, the form Apollon had most completely superseded the Doric form from Apollon. but the latter was certainly the older one. The spelling with O has to be taken as a secondary vocal assimilation to the ending on. The month Apelios and the Apelli are also found in the whole Doric region. In Delphi, Apollolios was the first month of the year, in which the Apelli were held. The Apelli were annual meetings in which tribal associations or communities purified themselves from ritual and spiritual contaminations, and in which the new members of the community, the Phoebi, were initiated. The god Apollon, may have derived his name from the Apelli. He was the arch of Phoebos, the true Kouros. Apollo was considered the author of evil and its averter as well, the god of purification, law, and order, and the god of prophecy. These three aspects deserve a brief discussion. The beginning of the Iliad introduces Apollo as the frightening god who sends a deadly pestilence into the cattle and the army of the Achaeans. One of the oldest etymologies of Apollo's name is a derivation from Apollimi, Apollio, but the author of the disease is also the one who can stop it. To that end, one has to propitiate Apollo by means of sacrifices, hymns, and prayers, as was in fact done by the Achaeans in the Iliad. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, this way of propitiating God to avert a plague was still advised by Apollo himself in oracles given at Claris and Didyma. Pagans and Christians is the book you find that in. Similarly, ambivalent gods, said to be both the cause of evil and of its disappearance, are found all over the world. In India, it is the god Rudra, who shows a remarkable similarity to Apollo. Let me make a comment right here that when Apollo was born, Zeus said that he was ruddy, meaning that he was reddish. He was looking down from heaven at the island of Delos. And Rudra can be construed as coming from a root word for red. And so that would match him right up with Apollo. Just wanted to throw that in there. Apollo was generally held to be the giver and interpreter of laws and city constitutions. In cities like Athens and Sparta, there were official interpreters of civil and religious law who were closely related to the Delphic oracle, which enabled Apollo in Delphi to exercise a considerable influence on the internal affairs of the Greek city-states. A special duty of the exegeti concerned advice on the rules of purification in cases of homicide. Murder inevitably brings pollution, miasma, on the killer, even if the latter has acted in self-defense, and therefore he is in need of purification, catharsis. Apollo, who according to the myth had to be purified himself after the killing of Python, remained the Greek god of purification. Although in the course of centuries he changed his views from prescribing a vendetta to regulating legal jurisdiction over homicide. Orestes, who was tried on the Areopagus, underwent the first trial for bloodshed, according to Aeschylus in the Eumenides. It was probably his character as god of law and order which caused Apollo's identification with the sun, that sees and hears all things. I don't know if you know this, but the sun used to be the tattletale of the gods in a lot of the old myths, or it could be the eye of the god, or this sort of thing. His name Phoebos, from which the name Phoebe derives, has often been interpreted as shining. Its precise meaning, however, is unknown. The legal aspect of Helios Apollo is clearly brought out in a number of inscriptions concerning manumissions of children and confessions of guilt from the temple of Apollo at Lerbanos in Phrygia, near Heliopolis, dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. Apollo was an oracle-speaking god from the beginning. His sanctuary at Delphi became the most influential political and religious center of the Greek world. That's saying quite a bit. Apollo responded to questions on regulations of communal life, of which religion was an integral part, on wars and their outcome, the founding of colonies, etc. Also, individuals came to Delphi with personal and sometimes rather trivial questions, though the evidence for this kind of oracle is quite scarce. In Fontainebleau, the oracles were given by a woman, the Pythia, who was seated on the tripod. What exactly happened during the mantic sessions is almost completely unknown. The traditional picture holds that the tripod was placed above a chasm from which vapors ascended, which brought the Pythia into a state of frenzy or trance, in which she uttered wild shouts which had to be interpreted by the prophetess. But the evidence to support this view is too scanty. After a short period of revived oracular activity in the 2nd century CE, Apollo almost completely relapsed in silence. However, the response to Aemilius' question as to where Plotinus' soul had gone, that's in Porphyry, Vita Polotini, who conjectures that Aemilius only sought Apollo's approval of his own poem on his beloved master. In Asia Minor, there were two other great oracular sanctuaries of Apollo at Didyma. Let me just stop for a second. That Aemilius, his name is Samuel, if you mix the letters around. And Apollo and Samuel are going to end up looking a lot like one another and are going to be closely related because of Apollo's plague and rectifying wrong with violence and evil things. So I just wanted you to notice this, that he's mentioned a character here, and I'll get into where they connect to Paul later. In Asia Minor, there were two other great oracular sanctuaries of Apollo, at Didyma and Claris. The method of consultation at both sanctuaries is for the greater part unknown. Claris had a prophet and Didyma a prophetess who offered Apollo's responses after drinking from an underground spring, Claris, or inhaling the vapors which came from a surface spring in the sanctuary at Didyma. The oracles were put into neat metrical verse by the Thespode, the singer of oracles, a Claris, or a prophet. I will go ahead and close this out as it's about all I wanted to get. The popularity of Apollo is reflected in the frequency of theophoric personal names and toponyms, that's place names, like Apollodorus, Apollonia, Apollonius, Apollonides, Apollophanes, Apollos, etc. Apart from the NT passages mentioned above in this work, we find such names also in the book of the Maccabees and in early Christian literature. The Christian presbyter Apollonius in Ignatius. Christian polemic against Apollo directed itself especially at his oracular sites, but nonetheless, in some places, his cult survived as late as the 6th century CE. This is Philip Dorian at Magic Jesus. Please subscribe.